The following is an emergency podcast episode about the war in Ukraine. All monetization of this episode will be going to Global Giving's Ukraine Crisis Relief Fund. Please consider making a donation yourself. Link in the show notes. Chris Miller, professor at Tufts and longtime friend of the China Talk podcast, on to talk about Russia, Ukraine, Putin, sanctions, and the impact on the Russian nation of this war. You write in a recent New York Times op-ed, there is no leader today with a better track record when it comes to using military power than Vladimir Putin of Russia. Why is he so into this?
Well, I think, it's worked. And so if you find something that works at achieving your interests, you're more likely to do it again. B, if you look at Russia from the perspective of what types of power it has, its military is by far the strongest asset it's got, the strongest card it has to play economically, in terms of soft power, in terms of influence abroad. All of these other cards are very weak, in part because Russia was just dealt a bad hand to begin with, and in part because the Russian government doesn't know how to cultivate them. But Russia's got a strong military. It's made it a lot stronger over the past 15 years. And so in some ways it's very understandable why Russia keeps turning to its military tools to achieve what it wants. But from the West perspective, obviously, this isn't something we ought to want, and it's something we've really struggled to deal with over the past 20 years.
Chris, you've spent a lot of your professional life over the past 15 plus years thinking and processing Putin and how he thinks about the world and economies and power. Has seeing this war kick off over the past few days shocked you? Is it a sort of continuation of longstanding trends? How do you sort of diagnose what ultimately went into his decision?
So I found the decision to go to war not surprising. And I guess I was struck by the extent to which all of U.S. intelligence on this was almost 100% right, which is that U.S. intelligence was saying since November that Russia was going to deploy basically the amount of troops that it deployed and forces it deployed and invade Ukraine. That's exactly what happened. And that most of the expert community focused on Russia was also right. There was some debate, but I would say the mainstream view, at least by 4 to 8 weeks ago, is that we were headed towards some sort of military escalation. I think what was more shocking was to everyone beyond the people who focus on Russian security affairs, for whom it's sort of surprising that in the 21st century nations invade their neighbors. Except, of course, that's exactly how international politics works. Nations occasionally invade their neighbors, and required a bit of updating of assumptions about how politics works. But I think what I was surprised by, and what a lot of people were surprised by, was the way the invasion happened this week, and in particular, the seemingly confused, not very well crafted justifications that the Russian government came up with for what was going on. And Putin's speeches, I thought, seemed particularly not simply aggressive, because he's often seemed aggressive, but also poorly crafted to win any sort of support or understanding or sympathy anywhere outside of the more nationalist wing of Russian public opinion. It wasn't a good pitch to the world stage.
I remember in 2014, after Crimea, you had Sergei Lavrov with this enormous shit-eating grin on his face after they came in and took Crimea. And the contrast between that and, what you saw the sort of national security meeting of all these people looking like they were staring death in the face, and having that kind of contrast of, on the one hand, this nation looking like it's, seeing all the angles and playing 3D chess, to don't have the words for it, to what happened today, as you described, of just like kind of a lot of weirdness, a lot of, not particularly coordinated messaging, some fits and starts on the sort of actual invasion. I mean, is this elder autocratic tendencies, as has past been coined on China Talk? What gives here?
Yeah, I think the Security Council meeting on Monday is the greatest puzzle in some ways of what we've seen over the past couple of weeks and months. We know that the Security Council, although it was publicly described as a live broadcast. In fact, if you zoom in on the watches of multiple participants in the meeting, it was pre-recorded, which makes it more puzzling because we had every key member of the Russian political elite present, a dozen of them, and every single one of them seemed a little bit uncertain about where things were going, and some of them seemed a lot uncertain. And what I was struck by was that we're used to the sort of technocrats in the government, Prime Minister Mishustin, people around him, of being not the most enthusiastic about Russia's foreign policy, even though they're the ones who provide the resources that fund Russia's foreign policy. But even long-time people who've made their careers in the Russian security services, like Sergei Narishkin, who Putin laughed at twice during his 1-minute-long speech, seemed very, very nervous, unclear, unsure about what was about to happen. And it was almost as though the Kremlin wanted to show that the elite was being whipped into shape in advance of this decision. But what's sort of striking to me is that I'm surprised the elite had to be whipped into shape, or that Putin felt like he had to whip the elite into shape, because my operating assumption before this was that, in fact, there was a whole lot of support for Putin's leadership, at least on foreign policy questions. On domestic issues, there's debate. On the economy, it's been a little bit underwhelming. But on foreign policy, Putin has made Russia great again. And the fact that there was evident confusion or maybe even dissent from Putin's foreign policy on the eve of the most important decision Putin will make as president, which is this war, seemed to me really striking and unexpected.
You know what it reminded me of, Chris, when we talked probably 2 years ago now about your book, Putinomics, you had a riff in there about how Putin really gets a kick out of like showing up at factories and like sitting down and yelling at the CEOs. And, from that, I spent a lot of time on YouTube watching this. And it kind of reminds me of an episode of this like network TV show in America where, Undercover Boss, where like the CEO of McDonald's or whatever goes into a local chain and then sees that like the manager isn't being nice to the frontline employees. And then at the end of the show, there's like a big reveal where the manager like takes off his mustache and says, "Oh, I'm going to fire you because you're like really crappy at running a cook line, or running a shoe store or whatever." And it kind of makes sense when you're like, okay, you're doing it because you're doing it on behalf of the from Putin's perspective. It kind of makes sense if you're doing it like on behalf of the sort of screwed over workers in the steel factory who are like mistreated and not getting paid when their hands get cut off or whatever. It's a way weirder dynamic when this is your team who you've had 20 years to pick, and you're about to go to war with them. To feel like you don't have to you have to dress them down, and then you dress them down in public, and then you record it, and then 5 hours later or whatever, you're like, oh yeah, let's have the whole world watch it. It's just a really odd series of decisions.
Yeah, no, completely agree. And before this week, we'd been talking a little bit about Putin becoming more isolated during COVID. During the pandemic, he, by all accounts, has enforced a very rigid regime of quarantine, making even cabinet ministers quarantine for multiple days before seeing him, regardless of their test results, regardless of vaccination status. And this is a bit of a puzzle because there's no evident reason why someone like Putin, who is, according to Russian media, vaccinated and according to the Kremlin in good health, to be nearly as afraid as he is of COVID. I mean, he's sort of as afraid as everyone was in like March 2020, except it's almost March 2022. And yet this does seem to have really affected him on a sort of personal level. It's cut off his access to information, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think this has impacted him on a personal level in a way that we didn't fully understand until the events of this week.
Yeah. You know what else the speech made me think of is like whenever people start talking a lot about how everyone else is on drugs, like it wouldn't surprise anyone, right? No doctor is gonna, when Putin asks for sleeping pills, no doctor is gonna say, maybe you should cut back a little bit. And there's a real like this is like a real psychological thing where like you have Elliot Spitzer, who's like the anti-prostitution crusader, all of a sudden is like spending half of his salary hiring prostitutes. This guy's starting a world war apparently because because entire nation is ruled by drug addicts. Like, it would not surprise me at all if this is the sort of, if we end up getting this reveal, 5-10 years, if the sort of Sergei Lavrov like redemption tour memoirs, if he outlives Putin, ends up having that little detail in there.
Well, I can't wait for the Sergei Lavrov memoirs. I hope they're written from The Hague. But I think that there's some evidence that Stalin in his final months or years was on some pretty heavy, I think opiates, if I recall correctly, but I'll have to check that. Don't quote me on that one. And then Brezhnev, of course, was somewhat famously addicted to sedatives in his final couple of years as well. So this is the danger when you have rulers for life or for almost life, is that the final years never look too good.
Chris, let's talk a little bit about the domestic reaction in Russia.
So I'm struck by, if you compare to 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, there was an extraordinary outpouring of support for the government as well as for the annexation itself. And people who were previously part of the opposition began expressing pride in the government. People who were totally apolitical began putting flags on their cars, things like that. The Russian society was unified behind the annexation of Crimea, except for a couple percentage points of the population. And today, this looks very, very different. I know personally a number of Russians who have posted on social media that they're opposed to the war, which was something that was a really a fringe thing to do in 2014. And now it's not a fringe thing to do. And so we're not going to get any sort of credible polling data on this anytime soon, but it does seem like there's certainly no wave of popular enthusiasm. And I think the popular skepticism just anecdotally seems to be substantially more than we saw in 2014.
What this dynamic reminded me of is that absolutely incredible chapter in William Shirer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which, if everyone hasn't read, they should go out and read. An American journalist who spent the 30s in Germany and then spent the sort of 10 years after the war reading Nazi documents, and sort of the book blended his sort of journalistic accounts of watching all these Hitler speeches with the sort of archival, like what was really happening. And yes, like there are points at which it's been superseded by 75 years of historiography, but the sort of atmospherics that he's able to provide as a firsthand witness and as and kind of just his skill as a writer is really is really worth folks putting on their list the next time they want to dig into 1,000 pages of Nazi history. But coming back to your point in particular, Chris, he as Nazi Germany invaded Poland, he contrasted the sort of mood on the street in Berlin with what happened during Anschluss, what happened during taking the Ruhr back, where in those after those actions by Hitler, there was rejoicing. People felt incredible, like we were back in the game again, and sort of Germany was on the march. But people recognized at the time that Poland was different, and that it was sort of, there was no justification, and that it was a sort of a real horrible thing to do to the to do to an independent nation. And the kind of delta between 2014 and today in Russia has some echoes of that, I think.
Yeah, no, that sounds right. And I think also, and this might also be a comparison point to 1939. But I don't like the comparison in general, but in this particular instance, is I think annexing Crimea was easy for the Russians. The war in Georgia in 2008 was easy for Russia. The war in eastern Ukraine in 2014 was easy for Russia. This is not looking like it's going to end up as a cost-free endeavor for Russia in terms of lives or in terms of money it's going to cost. And so I think part of the Russian reaction is already realizing this is going to be a long, messy, costly fight.
Speaking of costs, you've seen the West become much more willing in, even the past 48 hours to increase both the sort of economic as well as military costs when it comes to sort of sending in more trucks and planes for armaments and whatnot. But as the economic historian, Chris, I'm going to stick to the sanction side for you. What has struck you watching but before we get into the impacts, what has struck you watching the response in European capitals and Washington and actually around the world to sending a message to Putin economically?
I think the striking thing from where we stand right now, a couple days into the war, is that things that would have been inconceivable in European politics in particular are now becoming mainstream, and they've become mainstream in 72 hours. Like, and Germany, I think, is the greatest sign of the shift. The Germans just announced this morning they're sending arms to Ukraine. A couple days ago, it was helmets. So that's a pretty big shift in terms of German public opinion. And I think the European sanctions response has been just as dramatic in its shift. There's discussion today of cutting Russia out of the SWIFT interbank payment system, which would have just been unthinkable a couple days ago in Europe. And now it's controversial not to support it for European politicians. And in the U.S., I think we've seen a bit less of a drastic shift, but we've seen a big move over the past couple of days in the U.S. too. And I think that move is not done. I think that train is going to keep chugging along as long as the fighting continues. And we're going to see another couple of rounds of sanctions that are going to further cut Russia off from the rest of the world economy.
So what's the how does this impact and what's the sort of timeline where folks really start feeling the pain?
Well, I think the two big questions. One is, do we get to full blocking sanctions on the entire banking system? So thus far, the U.S. has imposed sanctions on a number of big Russian banks, but it's only imposed the toughest sanctions on one Russian bank, or one big Russian bank at least, VTB, the second largest bank in Russia. So this is like Iran-style sanctions, but only on one bank. And the U.S. could get to Iran-style sanctions on the entire Russian banking system, which would be a real mess for Russia because it would be very, very difficult to make international payments and to conduct trade. So that's one question. Second question is, do we get to energy sanctions? Right now, Russia makes around half, depending on the year, of its foreign exchange earnings by selling predominantly oil, but also gas abroad. And the Biden administration and some European allies as well are very sensitive to energy prices. And so the calculus the Biden administration is making right now, they won't tell you this, but this is what they're making, is their willingness to tolerate higher gas prices for the midterms versus their desire to punish Russia. And we've already seen it move because gas prices are higher than they would have been had there been no confrontation with Russia. And I think we're going to see that move further in terms of willingness to tolerate higher gas prices, because looking weak and looking inept is not going to be a popular thing to look before the midterms.
Can we talk about the Republicans for a second? What the fuck?
That sounds great. Well, I think actually that the past 4 days, the sort of Trump isolationist wing has either gone very quiet or rapidly changed views in most cases. You look at Josh Hawley of Missouri. 1 week ago, he was advocating cutting a deal with Russia. Now he's criticizing the Biden team for being too weak. You can question that his right to criticize, but I think that shift is pretty notable. And I think that's actually the interesting thing, is that it's fine to be an isolationist until America looks weak, and then all the isolationists want to be strong. Yeah. There's a couple of exceptions, but I think the exceptions are exceptions, and the rule has been a big shift since the invasion started.
Yeah, it'll be. I haven't seen a ton of polling, but it'll be really interesting to the extent to which that actually is reflected in the electorate, because, with Trump, you had a dose of high-profile, consistent isolationism as a sort of legitimized thing, right? And that hasn't been something that you've seen in the U.S. for a really long time. Outside of Rand Paul never had 1/100th of the platform that Trump did in the years that he that he was in power. So the extent to which that sort of continues to resonate is going to be really interesting. I remember there were a few polls before the war started where you had this very big generational gap with younger Americans being much more kind of comfortable saying, "Oh, we just want to we want to stay out of this. This isn't our business." But sort of like, I wonder the extent to which actually watching like a freedom-loving people lose their lose that will change folks, because the sort of the dynamics of this versus opposing the war in Iraq or wanting to get out of Afghanistan are very different, right? In terms of say you're say you're I don't know how to carry it. The dynamics of this are the dynamics of Putin invading a country are very different than sort of wanting to stay out of Iraq or Afghanistan per se.
Yeah, I mean, AOC talking about the military-industrial complex doesn't look very impressive this morning.
Yeah.
I think on the Trump coalition and foreign policy, Trump obviously was a sort of not consistent in what he said, but the Trump coalition, it doesn't seem, calling that isolationist, I think mischaracterizes what was going on. And if you look at the people who were in the Trump administration, were not isolationists. The Pompeos, all of Trump's national security advisors, different characters, all of them, but none of them were isolationists. So I worry that isolationist is not the right characterization for the mood we've been seeing. I think I think that doesn't really get at the policies that either the Trump team or a lot of the Republicans actually are supporting.
Yeah, but then, I mean, you get very quickly into the sort of like elite real America divide there, right? Because I think there is a real delta emerging in America between, anyone. I mean, the bar was lowered for Trump appointees, right? But like anyone who could somewhat credibly work in an administration is a different type of person than your median voter, right? Or even 30% of your median voters. And I don't think you could find your 30% of your 30% of America in the Cold War for sure, who would look at something like this and kind of want to roll their eyes and go back to playing Elden Ring. So that's it's something that I'm going to be watching really, really closely how American public opinion responds to this. We were on sanctions. We got off sanctions. Back to sanctions. How, if at all, does this change calculus in the Kremlin?
I don't think it changes calculus at all in the short term. If we get to Iran-style sanctions very soon, then it might start to change calculations. I don't think we're going to get to Iran-style sanctions soon enough, though, to really impact the conventional military fight in Ukraine. Though I think at this point we ought to, but my prediction is that we won't. But I think over the next 6 months, especially if we do, as I expect, do a couple more rounds of sanctions and intensify them further, the price is going to begin to become pretty clear. And if you combine the story of a higher price with a lack of domestic enthusiasm, I think we can definitely say, and maybe even lack of domestic support. I think we'll have to wait and see how the Russian populace responds. But that combination, high cost, low enthusiasm, is not a popular one.
Yeah.
Not a good one for Putin. So I don't think we should expect any sort of policy changes in the short term. But I do think he has increased the likelihood that he is no longer Russian president in 2025 for reasons other than his own death. I used to think his probability of being in power was only limited by life expectancy, but now I wonder whether he's opened the door to some more domestic pressure than he's used to.
So my kind of mental model of Xi is that fundamentally he cares, like he deeply cares about things besides taking Taiwan and besides sort of like, expanding national greatness as defined through territorial conquest. And, when he's out there trying to reform the party and like really wants it, there's a part of him which is very passionate about common prosperity and wants to bring toilets to rural China and, wants to make sure that the party is run in a clean and, marginally less corrupt manner than when it was when he came into office. And has some sense that like the well-being of the Chinese people is something that he is responsible for. And, when I think about, which is why like which is why I'm like still a little like less hopeful than I was before, but still like relatively hopeful that we're not gonna see this this sort of development happen in Taiwan anytime soon. When you look at Putin, like as you said, Chris, he doesn't have many other places to hang his hat on when he's thinking about the meaning of his existence and the meaning of Russia as the Russian Federation as like a entity. And once you start to define yourself only in terms of what you can achieve from a czarist colonial mindset, then these sorts of things start to matter less, right? Bringing on the type of leverage that economic sanctions can bring, because if all you're focused on is whether or not you can take X city and Y city and have Ukrainians turn off Ukraine's internet so they can stop making memes with you, is just a fundamentally different way of looking at the world. So I'm with you, Chris, and I think the chances of the coup or whatever happening are higher, because that's probably what you're hoping for. I think that's probably more the more likely scenario of that being the way in which sort of sanctions develop and have an impact than Putin seeing, oh wow, this is actually really scary. Or maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree. Maybe if he really sees a threat to his to his popular standing and social stability, he'll consider pulling back.
There's this extraordinary anecdote from, I believe, 1944 of one of the Yugoslav communist leaders visiting Moscow, and he meets with Stalin, and Stalin takes him around the Kremlin for big dinner, and shows him a map of the world, and the parts that are controlled by the Soviet Union are colored in red. And Stalin is at this time thinking about what he wants the post-war map to look like, and we know from other sources, he's had a couple of conversations with Soviet foreign policy leaders in the foreign ministry and elsewhere about what the map ought to look like, which the Japanese islands he ought to take, and where the border should be in the Baltic. And so Stalin is, in 1944, thinking of the world in terms of redrawing the map. And at that point, he was, I think, literally drunk on power, because he had defeated the Nazis, or was in the process of defeating the Nazis, marching to Berlin. Everyone knew he was going to win. And it became impossible to draw boundaries that were in a position that would leave him better, satiated, but not threatening his neighbors. And instead, he wanted to draw the boundaries all the way through the center of Europe. And I think that's kind of where Putin is right now. He's gotten a lot of what he wanted the past couple of years. He's faced resistance, but not very successful resistance. He was able to add Crimea back to the Russian Empire. He's able to basically put Belarus under his control. He sent troops to Kazakhstan in early January with no difficulty whatsoever. And so I do think this, we shouldn't be surprised. Although I was surprised and everyone was surprised, we shouldn't have been surprised when Putin made his big speech on Monday, citing ancient treaties from Imperial Russian history. I had to make sure I was remembering correctly which dates applied to which treaties and which czar had signed which ones. They were so far back in time. And I think that is kind of the mindset is, well, we're going to redraw the map. Let's have it a big redrawing and make sure we have enough territory. So I do think that's kind of the mindset right now, which is a dangerous mindset, as you say, to be in, because it does expose you to biting off more than you can chew.
Yeah. It also kind of, if you've been doing one job for 20 years and you've tried 10 projects, and you're, I'm going to make a new Silicon Valley project, fails. If you're, I'm going to modernize governance of our energy companies, that fails. If I'm going to reform our sort of fiscal balance and fix the weird pension stuff we have going on, if that fails too. The only button when you press and it works is invading stuff, then it makes sense that this is sort of how he's conditioned his mind to think. Chris, Camille, who I had you chatting with a few months ago, has now become a Twitter superstar. One of his threads was about the sort of balance between the Kremlin, state security, and the military, and the sort of trilemma that exists as you start wars, because then you kind of create generals, which if they do a good job, well, if they lose, then that's terrible. But if they do a good job, then all of a sudden you sort of have a new sort of popular person and center of power. I'm curious how that model relates to what we've currently seeing and what we may see play out over the coming months.
Yeah, it's interesting. I read Camille's post on that, and I think I would have a different view, which is that over the past 150 years, and probably longer than that, the Russian military has very rarely been a major political actor, except during civil wars when militaries are just by definition political actors. But during the Soviet period, you had people like Zhukov, but actually, the story was that he didn't end up becoming a political actor in any sort of serious sense, and it was easy to sideline him. From 1989 to 1991, when the Soviet Union was teetering on the precipice of collapse, the military didn't play any sort of meaningful role whatsoever. There was a coup, but it was led by the KGB. The military was divided and confused and didn't play a role. And in 1993, when Yeltsin shelled parliament, the military sort of followed his orders, but unenthusiastically, and no one understood the military was driving that in any sense. So I sort of end up thinking that actually the military is a lot less powerful than one might think for a state with a vast military and a vast military industrial complex relative to the security services, which have punched above their weight since, I think the late Tsarist Empire. And that to me is the really interesting question: is how have the security services been institutionalized such that they've been able to survive repeated shocks, the purges, the war, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and still stay as powerful as they are in Soviet politics. Even when you have the party running thing in Russian politics, even when you have a party running thing in Soviet politics, it was still, in a lot of cases, the security services that were actually calling a lot of the key shots. So that, I think, is the puzzle that I come away with, less from the military.
So, Chris, you're writing a book about chips, and we've seen an interesting dynamic of TSMC saying that they're going to stop selling stuff to Russia, which is like a somewhat tricky thing to pull off. On the one hand, they've made the argument, and Intel's made the argument as well, that like, look, we don't really know where our end users, where these chips go. These are commodities, and like when you have the stories of like, oh, an Intel processor being used in Xinjiang to like process faces of Uyghurs or whatever, that's their sort of response. So I'm curious just sort of how you see this this developing, because like if chips actually don't get to China like that, if chips actually don't get to Russia, that's like a that's a really dramatic thing, and like people are like harvesting old motherboards and stuff. I don't even know what happens in that space, but it seems hard for me to imagine that it seems hard for me to imagine like this really having a dramatic effect.
I think a couple of thoughts. One is that I think this will be enforced most strictly as it relates to goods that are most directly linked to the military-industrial complex. And we already have examples of 2014 when the U.S. tightened export control rules of severe delays to the Russian space program caused by problems with microelectronics. So I think this will have an impact in spheres that are adjacent to the military. A lot of the export controls focus as well on aviation. And aviation obviously is, among the most complicated manufacturing with 1 million different components per plane. And so you don't need to successfully restrict that many components to cause a big problem for aviation manufacturing. So there too, I think that'll have an impact. But broadly, I think you're probably right that it is tricky to enforce when you do have these complicated supply chains, and it's hard to track where everything goes.
So it's 60% of Russian ICT imports are Chinese. That, as a percentage of Chinese exports, is small. But very quickly, the U.S. is going to start looking at which Chinese firms are still continuing to export into Russia. And in the sort of the sort of political economy decision making of both the firms as well as Beijing are going to be really, really interesting to follow on this, because she's probably pretty pissed that that Russia went in and invaded Ukraine and put him and China in such an awkward spot internationally. But do they really want to entirely throw Russia under the bus? And is sort of being sneaky about those sorts of exports to Russia worth risking a dramatic escalation of what Biden has done so far when it comes to for export control restrictions and sanctions on the Chinese technology industrial complex? Because there have been over the past year and change, there have been a handful of sanctions on firms. SMIC is now on the entity list, but it hasn't had the same dramatic treatment that you've seen in the Trump administration and in Huawei. If Beijing is trying to sort of thread the needle and not give the folks in Washington who want to escalate on China more ammunition, they're going to have to be really careful when it comes to being, really sneaky about getting stuff across the border, or just stopping, delaying orders, sending, restricting the type of exports that are going to be going into Russia, such that they aren't those types of, fancy specialized aviation chips that Russia is probably really focused on getting at the moment. That's a story I'm really focused on and going to be watching closely in the months ahead.
Yeah, and I guess one question to ask there is, of these companies in China that are selling to Russia, how important is Russia a customer to them? Because I bet in many cases the answer is not all that important. In which case,
yes, I think you're absolutely right, and I think there is a really interesting research project to be done, which I'm sure is happening inside governments around the world, but also as open source researchers, kind of going down the list of Chinese firms and reading some Chinese 10Ks and figuring out exactly where the exactly which firms, because I'm sure if you look at the sort of macro OECD data, it's not a huge percentage of exports, but there are certainly going to be companies for whom this is a large and important market, and when it's that company in your region, and maybe you're getting sort of mixed signals from Beijing, you might make a different call than a larger firm like a SMIC, which has much more to lose by sort of going all in with supplying Russia what it wants in the coming months and years. Closing thoughts.
Well, I'm looking forward to listening to your other episodes on what China is thinking about the current crisis. I have no intelligent thoughts right now. I was surprised by the confidence with which you seem to think that Xi and the Chinese leadership were unhappy about the war. I'm less certain.
I mean, I don't think. I think this is too much chaos. I don't think Xi is a chaos fan. I think he likes things to be controlled. He likes sort of knowing what's happening, seeing the steps, and the wide range of outcomes which has now been opened up by this war happening is really concerning for him. And I think, from a longer term perspective, like the EU and the rest of the world really is now put on notice that autocrats are bad news. And I think a lot of what you're seeing in coalescing around in European politics around the sort of really harsh actions, which basically everyone is on board with now, is going to bleed over into them rethinking their relationship and dependencies on China. And that's probably not going to manifest quite as aggressively or dramatically as it has as it's currently happening in the Russia context. But thinking about stuff like the TTC and the Quad and alignment on stuff like export controls, watching a war happen by one country invading another, I think is concentrating minds at the possibility that the same thing could happen in East Asia. And that fact alone is probably going to really reshape the sort of global landscape which China was confronting, which already was trending in this direction of sort of focus and cognizance on the threat. And coming back to our conversation earlier about the dynamic in America, right? You saw like a pretty strong consensus about doing something on China, but it was widespread. But I think the sort of output that you've seen in terms of military form, legislation, military spending has been, could be a lot bigger. And this is the sort of thing which I think is going to absolutely rebound into America focusing more on these sorts of competitiveness things, which people have been speaking about in the abstract. And, you've seen USICA, you've seen the Competes Act, but there's way more that is potentially on the table, both from a sort of domestic economic competitiveness angle, as well as a sort of military angle. And this is the sort of thing which is really gonna wake folks up and turn sort of all Xi's fears, right, about the U.S. sort of focusing on this issue to the lost the thread in the last sentence. This is the sort of like that sort of response. I think Xi had already baked into his mind that the U.S. was going to get there at some point, but that point is coming a lot sooner. Well, but two things. First, I don't think it was necessarily inevitable, but now I think it is, and I think that point is coming a lot sooner, and the sort of response is going to end up being pretty dramatically amplified by seeing what's happening in Europe. So maybe that's wishful thinking on my end, that this isn't just sort of a flash in the pan moment, and people are watching things that are often awful and happening in CNN. And if this war ends in 4 days and things are quiet, we may be having a very different conversation about what the West response is going to be. But I think this is the Ukrainian resistance, which I think we shouldn't overlook at all, is a real I think is going to be a really decisive thing. And how the West and the world responds to it, because the conversations, if this was a fait accompli, are very different from a sort of policymaking perspective, and the tools on the table, if you're in Brussels or in Washington, are very different. If you can't, send arms and sort of drain drain Russia by forcing them to fight, and as well the kind of moral example that the Ukrainians currently are showing the world, that like, look at us literally dying for freedom here, and if you guys can't like get your act together and pass that like Pentagon reform and like buy some more freaking like water drones instead of the 50th destroyer, which like everyone knows no one needs because of some like weird parochial interest, what are you even doing in power? I think that sort of thing, the longer this potentially goes on, the more powerful that goes. So even if the war ends up ending in 2 days, the fact that there was this, there was sort of real resistance is something that I think is really capturing the world's attention.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I struggle to see how the war ends in 2 days. Even if the conventional fight does, the unconventional fight won't. So I think that dynamic will definitely play out. I guess the other takeaway is that if Xi Jinping ever starts making speeches about Emperor Qianlong or the great conquest of the Qing Empire, run for the hills, because that's a very bad sign when dictators have been in power for too long start dreaming about redrawing borders and their favorite old emperors.
Yeah. I mean, he kind of he does it a little bit, but like it's not like he's on drugs at the same time. So we have that to think. Chris Miller, thanks so much for being a part of China Talk.
Thanks, Jared.
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
I am excited to announce the Adweek Podcast Network, the first ever podcast network created for brand enthusiasts and anyone curious about the latest trends in marketing, advertising, technology, and culture. Adweek has partnered with leading industry voices to bring you analysis of trends, pressing challenges, and to share top-tier insights to help you level up your career, creativity, and strategy. Starting April 12th, you will get to hear brand new shows like Young Influentials, The Speed of Culture, Adweek Presents, and some of your favorites like Yeah, That's Probably an Ad, CMO Moves, and Season 2 of Metaverse Marketing. We are also happy to be the new home for amazing shows like Brave Commerce, The Great Fail, and To Dine For with Kate Sullivan. Learn more by visiting adweek.com/podcasts. That's adweek.com/podcasts.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Acast recommends.